For today's topic, we want to talk about the role of AI into safety-related engineering systems.
So in my experience, when it comes to validating AI systems, my old supervisor at NASA used to say there is no free lunch.
But we see a huge shift in terms of recognition of the potential of these systems to help us design better, safer systems.
Hello and welcome to today's conversation with Dr. David Ward and Dr. Richard Ahlfeld. I'm very happy to be joined by these two experts today to talk about AI in the realm of safety and engineering. David, I'd like to give you the chance to introduce yourself real quick and what you do for MIRA.
So I'm David Ward, I'm Global Head of Functional Safety at HORIBA MIRA. HORIBA MIRA is an engineering consultancy servicing the automotive industry and related sectors. I'm particularly responsible for functional safety, which is about ensuring the robustness and trustworthiness of electronic systems that are used in advanced applications such as in vehicles.
Thank you very much. And Richard, would you like to also give an introduction?
Of course. So I'm Richard. I founded a company called Monolith. I used to be a fellow and researcher for artificial intelligence at Imperial College London, at Stanford, and at NASA. And the one thing I love doing most is solving engineering problems with machine learning.
Thank you, Richard. And for today's topic, we want to talk about the role of AI into safety-related engineering systems. So, David, would you mind giving a quick overview of what we want to cover today in terms of ISO PAS 8800?
Yes, certainly. So I think there's been a sea change in the attitudes towards and acceptance of AI in safety-related applications over the last few years. The received wisdom about using AI in safety-relevant applications has historically been to not do, but we see the huge shift in terms of recognition of the potential of these systems to help us design better, safer systems more quickly, greater acceptance of these. So industry is now developing frameworks that allow us to accept the use of AI into the development of safety-related systems, for example, within road vehicles.
And why do you see the need for that coming in now? Because we've recently had a lot more and more AI adoption, but is there any particular catalyst that meant this had to happen now?
One of the biggest catalysts has been around automated driving and driver assistance systems, where we need to deploy vision and perception systems that are capable of sensing the environment and making decisions that mimic human behaviour. And AI is a great solution for doing that. So in just the same way as people learn about the environment that they're driving vehicles in and how to adapt, we see that AI and machine learning bring great benefits in that. But to quote a phrase, with great power comes great responsibility, so we need to ensure that that's done in a responsible way. I think as well, a lot of the focus has been around automated driving applications, but we do see AI bringing benefits in other applications around some of the more conventional systems in vehicles, anywhere where we need to process data, learn from large data sets, predict future trends.
Right. And automated driving is not something that's new, but this standard is. So I want to actually ask Richard, because these standards weren't always here, what have engineers been doing to make sure their systems are being developed safely, even in the absence of standards?
Mm-hmm. So I usually look at the way it has been done in a couple of different categories, because you can take these problems apart and look at the engineers, the people, the data, the processes, and potentially the algorithms that I've been looking at. I think the easiest one, if you start with data, to look at these kind of problems is if you can control what data goes into the system, you have very good control over what comes out of the system. And so in autonomous driving, we know you have halls full of people that are labeling specific data sets to make sure that the car always knew what to do in a specific scenario. That is obviously very tedious, but it is a very, very good way to make sure that your machine learning algorithm behaves in the way you wanted it to, because you set up the right data. Another approach here is to look at the people, the engineers. In my experience, this is an aspect that is often neglected completely. people need to know how these algorithms work. They need to know how they make decisions. Like when I sort of rent a new car, the thing is, I wish they would tell me how they actually programmed the underlying algorithms, because if I knew exactly how the system makes decisions, I would know when to trust and when not. And so training people to interact with machine learning and understand what they can do and can't do, in my experience, is one of the biggest factor to safety. Because if I get a new AI solution from you and you tell me, hey, you can trust this, I'm like, no. Can you tell me how it works? How does it make decisions? I kind of want to understand first what's going on under the hood a little bit before I blindly trust it. And then last but not least is, of course, algorithms. There's a wide area of algorithms that engineers can use. Some of them are actually very safe and very logical, sometimes even more logical than humans in a specific conditions. Other algorithms are actually very hard to understand. So let's say a Gaussian process AI tool is very logical. A reinforcement learning tool can be very arbitrary or seem arbitrary in its decision making to a user. So the last one always depends on, like, I've seen Gaussian process tools being certified in safety critical applications in aerospace engineering for more than 10 years. Trying to get a reinforcement learning algorithm into a car, it's a completely different story.
Richard, thank you for that explanation. And I think I really like the point about AI explainability. And something that you mentioned before, David, is AI controllability and AI resilience. Would you mind clarifying for the audience what these refer to?
Certainly. So I think Richard's made a really good point about the explainability of AI, that we need to understand what these systems are doing, even if we don't fully understand the how. And I think for too long people have said, well, it's just too hard to understand what's going on inside these systems. But we need to make efforts to understand that. When it comes to resilience and controllability, AI resilience is about ensuring that the system continues to operate. So in the presence of normal disturbances in the data that it uses, for example, the system needs to be able to continue operating as specified. AI controllability is about how we ensure that it operates safely, for example, by some kind of monitoring that the commands are to generate by an AI-based system are within, say, safe bounds, and taking some action if it looks like the system is going to step outside those bounds.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. And I want to ask Richard, from your perspective in practice, how does someone build an AI model that is resilient? What does AI resilience look like in practice?
I want to pick up this example from David on AI resilience. When I first started working on machine learning, you start with playing video games. You build something that plays Super Mario Kart, and essentially just tries to learn how to win this game. Now, the funny thing is, when you first program that and you just start with a generic vision tool that recognizes Mario on the screen, and you start learning the game and suddenly you're perfect, and then as a little hack, you turn Mario blue. You just change the color of Mario from red to blue, and immediately my machine learning model stopped working entirely, because as the main feature, it had trained to learn the red dot on screen, versus it should have probably have learned the shape. And this is something in AI resilience, if you don't realize that potentially cyclists can be different colors, and you essentially focus on them wearing a bright yellow vest, then you sort of have a system that towards its normal operating conditions is really unstable and will immediately stop working if you change something that is actually very reasonable. And so one example that I usually give is that you really try to perturb the system a little bit and see when it starts, being used in real conditions, are the things that I picked for decision making actually things that are safe? Because very few people realize how actually fragile AI systems can be if you don't pick the right one towards this sort of change.
Yeah, and if I could pick up on that, that's a really good point and really pertinent to what we do in automotive, particularly where we're applying AI to things like automated driving systems. In the world of standards, for about 20 years now, we've had a standard called ISO 26262 for functional safety, which is essentially about ensuring that electronic systems are robust against malfunctions. As we've started to introduce perception and decision-making systems, we've developed this new standard called Safety with the Intended Functionality, SOTIF, and SOTIF is very much targeting that sort of uncertainty, how you deal with unknowns in the environment, how you deal with things being maybe ever so slightly different from what the system was trained on or the data that it was given. And particularly when we're then going on to apply artificial intelligence in automotive applications, the idea is very much to build on those foundational techniques of functional safety and safety of the intended functionality so that we can develop an AI-based system that's explainable, that's resilient, that's controllable, etc.
Well, thank you both for these great points. I want to turn the conversation to a very important topic whenever we're implementing AI into engineering systems, which is data safety and data infrastructure. Now, David, I know you have some thoughts you'd like to share on the importance of data safety and infrastructure, and what are some best practices?
Sure. So yes, data is a really important aspect, and I think historically, particularly in terms of software development in automotive systems, we haven't really explicitly considered data. In ISO 26262, there is actually some limited recognition of that, particularly looking at some of the historical use cases we have in the automotive industry, such as calibration data, where historically you could develop something like a powertrain control system and then use data to adapt it for different vehicle configurations or different torque delivery capabilities. But now we see the data has to be centre stage along with the algorithmic behaviour of these systems, and essentially we're looking to adapt some emerging practice around data safety. It's covered in 8800, but essentially what we're saying is we need to look at how the data is generated, how data is stored and transmitted, and then how data is consumed by an application that makes use of it. And at all of those stages, we have to look at the possibility that data could be incorrect or could become corrupted, how we detect errors in the data, how we make the system robust against unwanted behaviour that could result from the data being incorrect or delivered in an untimely fashion, for example.
And Richard, does this correlate to what you've been seeing in practice over the last couple of years of data implementation, how engineers are managing the structure to their data and how it feeds into engineering systems?
So I think most engineers who I've seen who start in a machine application are surprised how incredibly high the data quality has to be when they get started. Right? Like I can't count the number of times when somebody said, hey, this is fantastic, clean, real data. It's all perfect. Can you use that for machine learning to build this new controller? And you start building this because, machine learning is just defining rules based off data. And you realize within like 24 hours on working with it, there's about 100 mistakes in this data. A sensor dropped out here, there's a weird shift there, somebody mislabeled that column there. And so you're already corrupting your system because you haven't realized how important that the nominal data, the sort of training baseline you were trying to use, wasn't clean to begin with. Because what we need in data quality for an AI system is close to perfection. What you need as an engineer to actually make a decision is actually quite rough. You can get the general trend from a plot. An AI tool with a single wrong point on that curve will immediately learn the wrong thing. And so I think realizing how much more effort you have to put into data cleaning and creating nominal data, I think that's the first, let's call it shock, most people have to go through when they start building machine learning tools.
I think that's a fantastic point that you make. That AI systems need this almost perfect data. And in the real world, in the engineering world, the data that comes into the sensors is very far from that usually. And even if we try to build the best system possible, we still have to deal with imperfections in the data.
So I want to move the conversation to talk about specifically AI in engineering systems. And when you build machine learning into a system that has these safety implications, how do you make sure that it will make the right decisions? How do you validate the AI model and the system itself?
So in my experience, when it comes to validating AI systems, my old supervisor at NASA used to say there is no free lunch. Like people assume that you can basically just use it, but actually there is no way around validating it meticulously across all of the different operating conditions that you need to use it in. I mean, yes, you can try and run simulations across millions of scenarios, and in autonomous driving, like that's exactly what people do. They run really complex simulations, but at the end of the day, even the best simulation is only that, a simulation, and it will never be as realistic and as accurate as all of reality. And so that's why I really like experiments like Waymo is doing in San Francisco, where they actually now have autonomous cars driving on real streets to get real experience of what's going on, because this real life validation is one of the only ways you can really test how well these next generation systems actually behave in a real complex environment.
Yeah, I'd like to kick upon the theme of validation, because I know you had a specific question about that, and we have seen that the term validation is used to mean different things to different people and in different contexts. And in general, when we talk about validation in engineering in general, it's about demonstrating that a product meets its requirements, but also that those requirements are fit for purpose. And although people use the term validation of AI in a slightly different way, when it comes to safety applications, then we need that similar mindset of validation. And in fact, what we do in 8800 is that we have the possibility to place safety requirements on AI-based elements. So we would define behaviours, functionality that's required from AI-based parts of a system. We would also set some criteria, some KPIs or similar, that we can then measure and determine how well the AI is implementing those requirements and how well it's meeting those requirements. So I think that's a really important aspect, that we have targets that we can apply to AI-based elements to determine how well it's doing. The evaluation of those could end up being qualitative or quantitative, of course, but that's a really important aspect of the approaches that we're starting to use in automotive now.
Okay. And just when we talk about validation, the standard does cover, I think, 3 different definitions of validation. We've got safety validation, and then AI validation, and there was another one, I believe.
Just validation.
Just validation in general. Yeah. And the standards makes a clear distinction between those.
That's right. Yeah, so as I was saying, validation in the broadest sense is ensuring that a product fulfills its requirements and that those requirements are fit for purpose. So we quite often talk about both verification and validation in the same breath, but generally verification is about saying, did we build a system correctly? Can we demonstrate that it implements its requirements? Whereas validation is about demonstrating we built the correct system. So in other words, are the requirements fit for purpose and giving us the product that's fit for purpose? In standards such as ISO 26262, we use safety validation specifically to state that we want to be sure that a product that we implement in a vehicle, whether it's a more conventional system and or one based on AI, actually meets the measures of risk reduction that we've allocated to it, so that the system is, as we put it in 26262, free from unreasonable risk. That's what safety validation is about. AI validation keeps its normal sense of meaning in the discipline.
So Richard earlier gave the example of validating the Waymo cars, how they validate by driving out in the real world. Does the standard have any commentary on how validation should take place for these AI systems?
I think what we've tended to focus on in the standard is the what we need to do rather than the how. So we want to avoid being prescriptive and saying you have to validate these things in a particular way. So one of the things that people quite often talk about when it comes to automated driving is the so-called million-mile problem, that you have to drive a huge amount of miles in order to demonstrate that the system is working correctly and that you've seen a reasonable selection of likely and unlikely scenarios. So what we're increasingly looking at is more pragmatic, more effective ways to give us that level of confidence, but without having to commit to say an ongoing test program that's very burdensome. And I think that simulation and even the use of AI itself can help manage the complexities and come up with effective strategies.
Right, thank you. Richard, you've been working on AI for engineering for the past 10 years. How have you seen AI validation occur in your experience?
So I think AI's presence in everyday engineering has changed quite radically, especially over the last 3 years. So I think when I did my first machine learning project at NASA in 2016, I was basically laughed out of the room because we tried machine learning in the 60s and it didn't work then and it doesn't work today. I think in general people were quite skeptical to this idea. Now, where you have very sophisticated chatbots solving intelligence tests that most people can't solve, I think there's a lot more presence of machine learning and artificial intelligence in everyday life, which means that many more engineers are actually willing to test things and try things, and they're not completely closed off to the idea that this might work or might even work better than what they've seen before. And I think on top of that, there's also the fact that many times what I've seen is that you would love it if your AI system was perfect and it could actually make autonomous decisions. But if it doesn't do that, people are happy to say, you know what, it's not 100% perfect, but I can still use it for decision making, right? I could still understand if the weather tomorrow is mostly rainy, so I'm going to bring an umbrella. Like it's not, it knows the answer, but it can help you with preparing for the right thing. So it doesn't have to be safety critical. It could just be a nice tool to help you figure things out.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that in the past, when you were laughed out of the room for trying to implement machine learning because it doesn't work, in the past, validation wasn't as needed because people weren't implementing it in real systems. But now that we are seeing it implemented in autonomous driving applications and other engineering systems, there's a more real need for validation and for us to do it in the proper way with the proper mechanisms.
Let me actually put onto that, because I think the reason why is very typical in engineering, right? Like if you have only a limited amount of data and computing power, a physics-based, simple rule-based system will beat a machine learning and AI algorithm actually by quite a lot. You will try and it'll essentially be not very intelligent, very well, this is a dumb system. I think what really changes is, and we've seen this in ChatGPT, right? Like they told Sam Altman, make it bigger, add more data. Like if you make it bigger and add more data, it suddenly becomes this next level of intelligent that actually beats your rule-based, physics-based original system. And that, I think, is where people are realizing now, oh, actually, this is quite interesting. And so I think it's the fact that it needs to learn, and only after it has seen a lot of data and examples does it become smarter than conventional approaches. And that takes a while.
Thank you for your perspective. I appreciate it, and I think a lot of the viewers are appreciating a lot of the insights that you're giving today. David, I want to ask you a different question on the topic of data, just to maybe clear up some misconceptions. A lot of people have fear around their data entering AI models for fear that they are misused or used to train the model, when maybe they've heard stories of ChatGPT, for example, hallucinating and bringing other people's data in. How does that play into what we are talking about today?
So again, within the frameworks that we've developed for safe use of AI in automotive, how we treat data, how we use data is very important. And what we would typically do is have some properties associated with data, like its integrity, its freshness, things like that. So it's very important as we collect and process data that we take parameters like that into account, and also, respecting people's personal data and privacy aspects.
Right, and that's covered in the standard, as we need to account for this when you're building the system.
That's right, yes, yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you for that. That's a very clear perspective, and it's good that it's accounted for in the standard. I want to talk about something to build on the topic of validation, resilience, controllability, which is the metrics that we are using to train the AI and validate the AI models. So I'd like to ask David first on what these metrics are, or what does the standard specify we should be accounting for when we are trying to build an AI model?
I think it's important to say the standard doesn't prescribe particular metrics. That's left to the developer of the application to identify appropriate metrics and what the appropriate targets are. So those would typically be associated with the safety requirements placed on an AI-based element. But then those metrics would be used as part of validation to determine how well the system's performing, where improvements needed, and so on. And I think the frameworks that we've developed for safe use of AI go hand in hand with some of the existing applications, such as safety of the intended functionality, to say what are the metrics, where have they come from, how do we know what's appropriate. So metrics for something like an automatic emergency braking system and its ability to sense and react to objects in the environment will be very different to say something like a battery management system that's using AI to predict cell health and so on.
So the standard really asks you to pick the metrics that are most suitable for what you are trying to do.
That's right, yeah. Rather than saying it has to be these particular metrics.
Well, to turn the conversation towards these particular metrics, when we're building AI models, we often talk about some pretty standard metrics such as model accuracy or R-squared score. Those kinds of metrics are the generic ones that everyone thinks of in academia. But in the engineering world, are those the best metrics that we should be using, or are there some other ones that we should be maybe taking more of a focus towards?
Funny enough, I've seen, I like that you don't prescribe metrics, because I've seen quite a few examples where people said the system has to be 99.99% accurate. And we built a system that was 99.99% accurate for predicting a crash test coefficient. Now, the funny thing about this coefficient was, though, there was always about 1.4, and it was quite easy to get it within to 1%. But the problem was that the difference between safe and not safe was actually within that 1%. Yeah. So 1.41 is good and 1.39 is bad. And so you can actually be 99% accurate, but still completely wrong. And so if all you do is look at the 1% error margin, there are things in engineering where 1% is actually huge.
Yeah.
And so that in itself is an example that I'm giving for just looking at this accuracy metric was completely meaningless. You needed to understand you can actually capture the trend. Is this making it safer or not safer overall, or make it even a lot more accurate? And so there's lots of these examples where if you focus on the wrong metric, you're actually not building a safe system. In my experience, things that work quite well in engineering that are not essentially like statistical values, like I got it right in 99.99% of cases, is if you put it in criteria that your product needs to meet. Like within manufacturing, I like to say, how many parts per million do you actually need to be able to deliver? And like, is 50 parts per million the maximum error rate that you're allowed to do legally, contractually? Then that's the machine learning error metric you should be looking at, and not if your Pearson coefficient is 0.98.
I think this is fantastic that you're saying the standard doesn't prescribe any particular metric. You need to use the right one for the right task. And Richard here is saying that in his experience in the real world, that's already what happens. So
yeah,
the standard has the flexibility that is built into it to make sure you can develop and build in the real world. And just on that note, we often see that the standards are not operating at the cutting edge of technology, of AI, machine learning, or whichever one the standard is about. There's always a little bit of a lag between a new discovery and it being put into the standard. So could you talk about how the standard will account for that and still be able to be relevant for the newest technologies?
Yes, certainly. So the standard that we've developed is effectively a form of pre-standard. So we recognise that what represents the state of the art and the agreed best practice in the industry is something that's still developing and is still under discussion. But we wanted to be able to say this is a common approach, a common framework. And as with many of these standards, ultimately they're a framework to give us a common language and to have informed discussions throughout the supply chain and to all be on the same page in terms of the practices we use, the targets we set, etc. I think we have to recognise some of these spaces are very fast moving, and Richard himself has reminded us how quickly AI has come to the fore. And sometimes there's a criticism of standards that they don't adapt enough, that they're not flexible enough. But we think there's a balance to be had. On the one hand, because of the lead time to develop things like vehicles and the length of time that we have to support them in service, we need a certain degree of stability. It's not something that we can update every 5 minutes. But at the same time, we also need the flexibility to recognise where the technology is fast moving. So generally, the approach we like to take in these standards is to be more goal-based, to be more objectives-based, so as I've already said, to say what we need to do, but without necessarily dictating the how. So if a new improved way of doing something comes along, then we're able to carry on using the same frameworks, but potentially with some adaptation to a new technology or a new solution. And over time, of course, these standards and the associated frameworks do get updated, and we already recognise, particularly with the standard that we've developed for AI, that already the state of the art, the application in other sectors will already have moved on beyond the point in time at which we published this standard. So we're already taking steps to understand where the next destination is and what we need to do next to keep these things updated. Right.
So it sounds like it's a combination of keeping up to date with the newest developments so that you can implement them in the standard, but also building enough flexibility into the standard so that it is relevant. It is something that people can look to as best practice.
That's right. So we need stability, we need a common framework, but we do need flexibility and adaptability as well.
That makes sense. And just on the notes of what's coming next for the standard, but also for AI safety and engineering in general, what are your thoughts there?
So the standard that we've developed in automotive actually builds on an information report that was developed previously by a cross-sector group, and with us now having developed the automotive standard, that the group that developed the cross-industry document is going on to update that. They're moving closer towards a standard now, and we're pleased to see that some of the ideas and some of the concepts we've developed in the automotive standard are finding a home in the wider safety standard for AI. So we see that there's ongoing efforts in standardisation around what good looks like for safe use of AI, but we also see a lot of work going on around things like metrics and KPIs and so on for the use of AI in general. So there's quite an ecosystem building up of standards, good practice information to help people make appropriate use of these technologies.
I like that you're saying all this information is coming together to build into best practices and something that everybody can access. And I want to turn this question to Richard to ask the same thing, basically. Where do you see AI in engineering, particularly for safety? Where do you see it headed? What are the next steps for it, or some trends that we are seeing?
I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen so far is regulators. I've seen aircraft projects, rocket projects, autonomous driving projects where engineers actually came up with ingenious ways to build new AI systems and even to validate them, but it failed because regulators today just don't know how to handle this. They don't know how to even check it against what's been done by governments across the world for years. And so I think as engineers and industrial standards are getting smarter and better, so will regulators, and then the regulators will catch up, and then so I think it's a bit of a ping pong. But overall, I'm excited about the direction of travel, because I think on both sides, people are now learning, and I think in the long run, it will lead to smarter and safer systems for everyone.
Well, smarter and safer systems, that's what we're looking to build here, and that's the purpose behind these standards.
Thank you both for your perspectives on where AI is headed. I want to ask a question on behalf of all the engineers building AI into their systems. How can they find out about best practices, stay up to date, and just in general make sure the systems they're building are following the most up-to-date research and developments on AI safety? And maybe let's start with you, David.
Yeah, so there's lots of great resources available that people can can draw on. In terms of some of the standards themselves, then we have training courses available that give an overview of this to help people get oriented and to understand what the scope of these is and where they fit in. And then I think depending on the particular application to go and investigate some of the other standards, some of the research papers and things like that. There's various academic consortia that are looking at safe and trustable AI, for example. So there's lots of great resources there. And I think picking up on a point Richard made earlier about the people aspect of things, ultimately, I think sometimes there's a certain amount of fear associated with these technologies, and there need to be. But depending on where people want to go personally in response to these technologies, there's lots of training and professional development opportunities out there to build their own experience, to have access to tools and techniques and so on to make use of these things effectively.
And it does sound like there are all these resources online. There's probably a new AI company being spun up every other week. So the internet is full of this type of information and across a whole bunch of different purposes, whether it's generative AI or what we are talking about today. So Richard, maybe a more direct question on, if an engineer is looking to implement AI into their system today, where can they go to find the best information, or what have you seen them look to when they're trying to implement safety and follow best practices?
So apart from obviously what you've mentioned, which is trying to look for literature and examples for your specific use case, because like looking at an assisted driving system will be very different to an autopilot, and so looking at benchmarks in your specific industry would obviously be point one. I think apart from what you've already said, what I would add is that it helped me a lot, and this is what I used to tell my students at Imperial College London, is get familiar with some of the methods yourself. There's a course at MIT which you can do online, machine learning for scientific problems, where you can get a good first impression of how these tools work, right? And I think as soon as you've done this course, which maybe takes 6 weeks, you get an idea that it isn't magic, that it isn't necessarily a black box, so there are different tools and you can understand roughly how the machine reasons. And that I think is a lot of help to basically understand, okay, this is what it can do, this is what it can't do, so this is how I'm going to try and solve my problem with this software.
All right, well, thank you both today for your perspectives. It's been most insightful, and I think our audience will really appreciate everything you've spoken to related to the standard, but also AI safety in general. So thank you both for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon.